So, Bob, your writing challenges the Western idea of the mind as sealed, bounded,
Mm.
and you invite us to see it as porous and not something in the box and it is sealed and done. Could you share what you mean by the porous mind, and perhaps give us a real life example how this shows up in trauma or healing work, Bob?
Okay, that's a huge subject. I could write another 400 or 500 page book just on
Please.
that. I think the modern West, and because modern Western culture and science and therapy are spreading all over the planet, it's now sort of the modern global attitude, is the only one in the history of humans that has this model of mind that Tanya Luhrmann, the great anthropologist, calls it the citadel model of mind, where we think our minds are bounded, they're contained inside our skull, they're private, they're ours, they're our property, and they constitute our identity. Now, this looks strong, fortress, but it's not. It's incredibly brittle. And that makes it very weak. The first time someone who is deep in this citadel model of mind hears a voice or experiences some kind of spiritual experience or extrasensory perception or any of that, they think, my brain is broken. And they're terrified and they run to the nearest shrink to get some drugs. So it's incredibly brittle. And a woman in England called Isabel Clarke, who's a psychologist who works mainly inpatient with psychotic people, says one reason we in the West get such lousy results with psychosis is that we have what she called the billiard ball model of mind. It's the same idea as Luhrmann, but they don't know each other's work. And they come from
Mhm.
different fields pretty much entirely. So this view, historically and from a worldwide perspective, is very much a minority view. And I think that we have this citadel of mind. I think it's incredibly toxic. And I actually think it's the root cause underlying the epidemic of mental illness that's going on now, and a lot of our cultural and social difficulties. There's a lot of people who've traced the history of this. A lot of Owen Barfield, the Canadian philosopher. No, Owen Barfield was the English one. Charles Taylor's the Canadian one. Uh, Daniel Siegel, interpersonal neurobiology, as all, he says this worldview of our citadel mind is so deeply built into the European languages we can't even think clearly about the nature of mind. We are constrained. We're hogtied into this very, very painful thing. Gregory Bateson, the great anthropologist and cybernetics guy, he wrote a book called Mind and Nature, where he said mind and nature evolved together. Any attempt to understand one out of that relationship is doomed to failure and absolutely meaningless at a fundamental level. That's modern psychology, is the attempt to understand mind as though it was something you could separate off from nature and consider separately. You can't. It fails. And I think there's all sorts of measures of the porosity of mind, which is interesting. We can measure it, and we have all these academic ways of measuring it, but we sort of deny it. And one good example is the schizotype scale, which was developed in England. And the guy was first developed this scale. He wanted to see if there was a schizotype where if schizophrenia was a separate disease category, you'd have this continuum, and then there'd be a break when you went into the disease state. That would indicate, oh, this is really a separate disease. That's not what he found. He found it's pretty continuous. People have these qualities of porosity of mind, hearing voices, seeing visions, all that kind of stuff. And then he also realized the people high up on this scale also were vastly more creative, vastly more creative. They had more spiritual experiences, they had extrasensory perception, they had all these things, and they had the classic deficits, you know, that um, there's a lot that there's a transliminality scale from
Mhm.
Australia. There's just tons of these things. Um, Telling an absorption scale is the one that Tanya Luhrmann bases her work on. So there's all these things that show our mind is porous. We can even measure how porous, but it's so built into our fundamental worldview that we can't get away from it. And I want to go off on a little bit of a.
Please.
There's a guy named Matthias Desmet who's written,
Mhm.
I think, a brilliant book about the psychology of totalitarianism. And he was interested in what sets a culture up so that totalitarians can take over. And he went back to Hannah Arendt, who was a very influential figure in analyzing the Nazis after World War II. She talked about the atomization of the subject. Basically means once people come to believe they're this isolated thing, i.e.,
Mhm.
have a citadel model of mind, they feel sort of general anxiety and fear about the whole world because they no longer feel connected to it in any
Mhm.
way. Once they feel that generalized anxiety, that tends to go to generalized hostility. You know, if you're afraid all the time, you tend to get angry all the time. Once you're like that, anybody who gives you something to hate, some focus for that anxiety and that hostility, that will unify you and provide you psychological relief. And Desmet says this dynamic is the foundation of all totalitarianism. I think there's a lot to that. It's the same issue of this idea that we are not porous, that our minds are not porous, is toxic, and it's a root cause of much of our the modern totalitarianisms, a lot of our mental illness, and a bunch of other ugly stuff. I sort of went off on a little bit of a rant.
Mhm. No, I mean, it's really cool. I mean, I got to learn a lot of things. Thank you so much. So, Bob, in your work with IFS, you've spoken about unattached burdens. In the book, also, you have talked about unattached burdens quite a lot, and you have explained what it is and how everything works around that. I mean, whether it is energies or traumas, and none of it actually originates within the client's own psyche. I mean, it's something else altogether. Bob, can you share an experience where you encountered this in your practice and how the porous mind framework helped you navigate it?
Okay. If you don't have a porous mind framework, you think any experience of something inside your mind that's not part of you, that's evidence of insanity, evidence that your brain is broken, and evidence that you need medications.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
and it is normative and healthy for people to experience things in the depths of their own subjectivity that are not parts of themselves. For example, there was a study of couples who'd been married 45 years and one spouse dies. 80% of the surviving spouses hear the voice of the deceased spouse. This is not pathology, gang. This is normative human experience, you know? So if you don't have a porous model of mind, you're forced into pathologizing all of this. And not only are these experiences normative, they're often wonderful and very, very, very valuable. Many creative people say, oh, the idea for that piece of music or poem came to me from outside my mind and entered me. Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, heard a voice his whole life. And that's where Western philosophy comes from, a guy hearing voices. This so to pathologize all this is really bad or wrong to my mind. And it really limits us. It limits the size of who we take ourselves to be. We're much bigger beings than that, much bigger beings. Let me give
Mhm.
you a very specific example of an unattached burden in my own life. I had, I still have, but I'm doing way better than the doctors ever thought possible. About 10, 12 years ago, I was told I was going blind from this retina disease. And I can still read and drive. My vision's pretty good. I get all the Western medical treatments, even though they're really obnoxious. But I also worked with Dick Schwartz about what was going on psychologically, spiritually, energetically. And what I saw working with him was a creature that looked like a cross between a spider and a scorpion that was poking at the retinas in my eye, causing blisters. And that was exactly the physiology of what was going wrong with my eyes. I'd get blisters on my retina, and this makes you blind pretty quick, you know. And we were able to work with this spider scorpion thing. And it was from my mother, who was a truly horrible individual. And she was trying to blind me. And it was not a part of me, not something to be welcomed into me. It was something to be contained, removed, and gotten to move on. And we did that. And I'm doing way better than the doctors thought possible.
Mhm.
And,
Good.
if I didn't have the porous model of mind, if I didn't realize that things could get inside my psyche that were not part of me, I would have dismissed that whole experience as some psychotic hallucination, and I wouldn't have been able to work with it in a way which probably has helped save my vision.